and we'll go ahead and get started. So we'd like to start off our webinars with the promise of community action. It just grounds us in the work that we do. So I invite you to say this with us at your desk. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. All right, so our agenda for today, I'm going to give a little bit of learning community information. This webinar is hosted by our Learning Communities Resource Center at the Community Action Partnership. Then I'll introduce our presenters for today. They're going to be talking about evaluation and shared measurement. Then towards the end, we'll go into a question and answer session, but make sure you send in those questions throughout the webinar in the chat box. And then at the end, we'll also go through our remaining meeting schedule and upcoming events. So our learning community, like I said, is sponsoring these webinars, and really the purpose of the Learning Communities Resource Center is to analyze community action outcomes and identify those promising practices that are available within the field, as well as within our network that help to alleviate the causes and conditions of poverty. So we're all about building that capacity to be able to fight poverty throughout the nation. Everything that we do also is grounded in our National Community Action Network Area of Change, and we have three main goals. And so the first one is really focused on individuals and families being able to achieve that economic security. Then our second two goals are really focused on the community, having communities where people are healthy and have economic opportunities, and then also having people engaged in their communities as well. And so these two pieces definitely relate directly to this work of collective impact and bringing people together to build those communities where people are living. Also, throughout our learning community, we have several different topics. And like I said, this one is part of the results of the community level learning community group. But we have several other topics that we often focus on through these webinar Wednesdays. And the top four groups or topics are actually open groups, so those can be joined at any time. And then we also have some that are by application only, like the intensive learning community groups and our communities of practice. So really kind of what we're aiming for within our learning community is lots of small action with lots of people and that big change that we're hoping to achieve throughout the learning community. So our learning community is made up of all 11 regions. We have 33 states that are represented, as well as 407 of the nation's counties. So it's a very diverse representative of our community action network. Our team that kind of makes all this possible is shown here on the screen. And so you can see that we have our project director, Tiffany Marley, training and technical assistance director, Jar Crocker, myself, Courtney Kohler, is a senior associate. We also have Hyacinth McKinley, a program associate, and Liza Porras, also a program associate. And then Jeannie Chaffin serves as a consultant to our Community Action Economic Mobility Initiative. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and go into our topic for today. We're going to be talking about shared measurement and evaluating collective impact. And so we're happy to have two presenters with us today from FSG through the Collective Impact Forum. We have Tiffany Clark. She's the Associate Director of Strategic Learning and the Evaluation Team. And then we also have Jennifer Juster, and she's the Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum. So at this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Juster, and I'm delighted to have my colleague Tiffany Clark join me today. Some of you may have been on some of our previous webinars, and we're glad to have you back and glad to connect with those of you who are joining for the first time. So just to orient you, let's see, get my slides moving here. Courtney, could you just remind me how to go forward?
Yeah, there should be over at the left-hand side of your screen. There's little controls that should say 11. There's an arrow up and down. Yep.
There we go. Great, thank you. So just to give a little bit of context about who we are for those who are joining for the first time, the Collective Impact Forum, that's the program of which I'm the Executive Director, is a program of the larger organization FSG in partnership with the Aspen Institute. And we wanted to just share a little bit about this so you understand what informs the work that we are going to be sharing today. So when it comes to collective impact work, there are really 3 different ways that FSG supports the field. We provide hands-on support. This would be where we work very closely with communities to launch and implement collective impact in practice. And you can see a number of those different collective impact examples on the left-hand side of the screen, different issues and geographies where we have done that. My colleague Tiffany, who's with us today, is one of the members of our team that is very involved in these types of hands-on projects. On the bottom is the learning community. That is the Collective Impact Forum, and that is where I sit in the organization. We do trainings and workshops and conferences on the topic of collective impact. We also have a robust resource library and an online community of over 25,000 practitioners who are engaging or interested in collective impact. So that's really our broad purview across the field of what's happening when it comes to these cross-sector collaborations. And then in the upper right, it says thought leadership, and that is the publication and research work that we either conduct or commission to help advance knowledge on the topic of collective impact and cross-sector collaboration. So those are just the different perspectives that we bring to today's session. And just to let you know where we're headed today, we are going to start with a quick refresher on the topic of what we mean specifically when we're talking about collective impact as an approach to collaboration. Again, this might be a little bit of a repeat for some of you on the line, but I want to be sure that we're all grounded in this terminology and framework. Then we're going to spend the balance of our time talking about 2 different pieces related to learning and measurement. The first is shared measurement, and we'll talk more about that as we go. And then the third is evaluating collective impact. So shared measurement being a more narrow set of measures to track progress of the group, and evaluating collective impact being the more holistic approach to learning and evaluation that we are encouraging collaboratives to take on. And this will make a lot more sense as we get into the details, but that is where we're headed with today's session. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tiffany to give us the refresher on collective impact. And we, just while we're up here, we will start with the poll. So over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, before we dive into more details today, we want to have a sense of who's on the phone with us. And we thought we would do that by getting a sense of how familiar you all are with collective impact. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to respond to our poll, we'd just love to know where you are on the scale of not at all familiar with collective impact, this is the first time you're hearing about it, to you are deeply involved in a collective impact collaborative effort and you really understand it well. Just give us a sense of where you are today, and that will help us calibrate how we facilitate the webinar.
All right, we'll give you another about 10 seconds or so to give your answer. Okay, we're going to close the poll. Okay, and I'm sharing the poll results now. It might take just a moment. All right, do you see the poll results coming up?
I do. I see we have a somewhat shy group today, or perhaps people are not in a place where they can respond to the poll because we didn't get very many answers, but that's all right. So what we'll do is we'll just proceed ahead, and as Courtney mentioned, feel free to use the Q&A or the chat box if you have questions as we're going along. So Jen, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So we wanted to ground everyone in the same definition, and we can go from there. So as we talk about collective impact, what we're referring to is the commitment of a group of important actors from different sectors to a common agenda for solving a specific social problem at scale. And over the next couple of slides, we'll break this down into what we mean more specifically. Next slide. As we think about collective impact, at the end of the day, what we're looking for is collaborative efforts that over time have achieved real results at scale. And as FSG looked out into the field, worked with initiatives firsthand, as well as heard from people in the field, we saw again and again that efforts that were able to achieve results at scale had 5 key elements. Those were a common agenda, that people were really committed to a shared vision of change that came from a deep and common understanding of the problem that they were hoping to solve. That people had shared measures. They were committed to working together to collect data and measure results, with a focus on performance management for the collaborative as a whole and sharing accountability for success as well as challenge. That they engaged in mutually reinforcing activities, which meant that they were coordinated through a joint plan of action. I'm sure many of us have experience working with groups where people show up at the table, they share their approaches, and they go off at the end of the day and keep doing whatever they were going to do anyway. This is different. This means people are willing to adapt their individual organizations, programs, or strategies in order to complement others while still differentiating their work so that they're each bringing what they uniquely have to bring to the table. That they engage in continuous communication, which means people are consistently in contact with each other, open about success and challenge and what it will take to build the kinds of trust and relationships that help people work together effectively. And finally, that there's backbone support, which means that there's dedicated staff and resources that help there be glue holding people together over time for convening, for coordination, for communication, and for helping to organize joint efforts. These 5 elements, as well as the definition on the previous slide, are essentially what we mean by collective impact. We've seen this approach in many communities across the nation and all over the world. So in addition to these 5 elements, on the next slide, we'll also see that there are 8 principles of practice. And Jen, if you could advance the slide. Great. So as people have worked with the collective impact approach over time, they've shared what they've learned about what makes collective impact work. And out of that came 8 principles of practice. The first is designing and implementing the initiative with a priority placed on equity. We want to achieve more equitable outcomes. We need to go into the work with that intention and design our strategies, approaches, participants, relationships around that. Include community members in the collaborative directly so that their voices and experiences and ideas can shape the effort. Recruit and co-create with cross-sector partners. We really need to have many different types of organizations and individuals involved in order to make systemic change in our communities. Use data to continually learn, adapt, and improve. The idea of deeply embedding data within the initiative is something that people have learned is a key to success in these efforts. Cultivate leaders with unique system leadership skills. And that means finding people and also building the capacity of people to see across the whole system, to see beyond their organization and their sphere of action in order to see possibilities for changing the ways that systems function in communities. Focus on program and system strategy. So again, doing the programmatic work that's needed to meet people with services, but also change the way that systems function in terms of policies, funding flows, the ways that organizations are relating as part of achieving impact. Build a culture that fosters relationships, trust, and respect, seeing those intangibles as being as instrumental to success as having the right kind of technical approaches. And then finally, customizing work to fit local context. Next slide. So structurally, collective impact initiatives tend to look fairly similar. So underneath the common agenda and the shared measures that unite people over time is a set of structures for coming together and collaborating in real time. So we typically see a steering committee, a cross-sector group that guides the overall strategic direction of the effort and builds momentum, brings support to the work, supported by a backbone organization, as I mentioned before, which can be one organization or multiple organizations coming together to provide the capacity for convening, communication, data collection, et cetera, to support the effort. And these two bodies are typically complemented by a series of working groups that are tackling different aspects of what will be needed to solve a problem, and thus have different combinations of people from across the community. It can include nonprofits, businesses, funders, community organizations, faith leaders, and community residents coming together to address specific components of the problem that will lead to moving toward the overarching goal of the initiative. So that's where we'll stop with just the collective impact refresher. Just wanted to make sure, as Jen mentioned, that we're all starting from a common base of understanding before we delve into our specific topic of today. I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Great, thank you. And before we go on, I'll just give a minute. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that. But if there are any questions you have before we move from the overview of collective impact to shared measurement and evaluation, now is a great time to put those in. So I'll just give about 30 seconds for that in case anyone has something they would like to ask at this point. And Courtney, you can let us know if you see anything come in.
Okay, not seeing anything at this point.
Okay, well, we will keep going, and feel free to put questions in the chat box as we go. So let's dive into one of the first pieces of today's deeper new content, and that is related to shared measurement. So Tiffany mentioned when our colleagues at FSG looked across the field and were looking to identify what different elements cross-sector collaboratives had in common that were achieving population-level goals at scale. What they saw were these 5 things that we now call the 5 conditions, and one of those is shared measurement. And so this is what we really consider to be one of those core pieces of collective impact, and often this is something that differentiates collective impact from other forms of collaboration that might make sense in other circumstances. And when we're talking about shared measurement, we're really talking about the collaborative coming together and identifying a subset of measures or a few metrics for tracking progress in the same way across organizations and having everyone paying attention to the same measures, measuring them the same way to really facilitate learning and accountability across the group. And when we talk about the reason and the benefits for using shared measurement, there are a few. So first, improving the quality of the data. So in some cases, when shared measures are implemented, different participating organizations in the collaborative all agree to use a similar measure or approach to collecting data on a topic. And this often can lead to capacity building of participating organizations to meaningfully collect data in the same way. And participants in this have reflected that it's really helped improve their ability and the quality of the data that they are collecting to really go through that process in the same way as others and receive the same kind of training and consistency across the community. So another benefit of shared measurement is a consistency in tracking progress toward a shared goal. So you can actually think about apples to apples instead of comparing apples, oranges, and pears if you're talking about a similar but not quite the same data point. So an example of this that I often think about is an initiative that was focused on improving outcomes for the juvenile justice population in New York. And one of the outcomes they wanted to track was recidivism rates. And I might have shared this on the first webinar, but I'll repeat it here again. So when the group sat down, they thought about, okay, it's important to measure recidivism rates. And when they began discussing this among themselves, they realized that across a group of over a dozen partners, they had multiple different ways of technically defining and measuring and counting recidivism rates. So they took the time to come to a shared definition, a shared understanding of how they could all consistently define and measure recidivism so that they could actually aggregate the data and figure out across organizations what their impact was, but also in more detail understand the work that each was doing to address and improve and reduce, reduce recidivism rates. And so even the process of identifying the shared measure and how it is defined and measured across organizations consistently was a really valuable process for that group. And then it also enabled what's listed here as the third benefit, which was it enabled greater coordination and collaboration across the groups because they were able to have that consistent understanding of what they meant. And we see this across consistently across groups that come together that actually, and you might have had this experience of actually sitting down to talk about something, you realize that while you might be calling something a similar measure, you actually might be talking about a nuance difference. So we see this with graduation rates or homeless counts or other forms of data that individual organizations might be collecting. Having shared measurement also certainly can improve learning and course correction as a result of that learning when groups are intentional about coming together with those shared definitions and approaches to measurement. And as a result of that learning, often we see the groups taking on new action because of what they're learning from having those shared measures in place. And so let's think about this just another way when we ask what is shared measurement, just to clarify what it is and what it isn't. So what is it? We're talking about the progress that we're making and how that can inform the work that we do. So it's not just the measures, but also the learning process that's associated with the data. What is it not? So it's not meant to isolate the impact of a single organization because in your collaboratives, as I'm sure you know, you are all of the different partners are in concert contributing to the outcomes that the group has focused on as a collaborative. So shared measures certainly are not really going to be able to be attributed to a certain individual organization, but rather collective progress. When we say shared measurement is not simply data collection, what we mean is that the process of data collection is part of shared measurement, but of equal importance is using and learning from that data and adjusting action as a result. So shared measurement is the whole process, that learning loop, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm not going to read through the whole list here, but the last one I'll say, shared measurement is not the same as evaluation, and Tiffany is going to talk about evaluation later in this webinar, but shared measurement is a piece of evaluation. It is the progress on some typically population-level indicators or indicators around strategies that groups are taking on together through your mutually reinforcing activities, but it's not the totality of evaluation, which is a much broader frame to think the how and the why of how the work is developing and the broader, so a much broader set of questions that we will tackle later in the webinar with respect to the broader frame of evaluation. So as I've mentioned a few times, when we think about shared measurement, we want to think about a learning loop, a learning cycle. So shared measurement, what we have on the upper left-hand corner, the gray arrow, is really thinking about the actual indicators and measures itself and identifying those common metrics and tracking progress. Once we have those, it's super important for the collaborative to use that data to learn from each other. So what are we learning because of the data that we are collecting and making sense of? And then in the blue arrow on the bottom, as a result of that learning, what can we individually or collectively do differently because of what we're learning? And so this, I'm sure many of you have learning, planning and learning cycles embedded in your organization or collaboratives work. But we want to emphasize here the importance of using and learning from data to improve strategy and work, as opposed to just checking data very infrequently for the purposes of accountability and not a true learning process. So I'm going to take a pause here, and we're going to pull up our second poll. So let's invite you back to your screen and keyboard. So the question here we want to get a sense of is, where is your collaborative in the process of implementing shared measurement? So the first choice is, we're engaged in collective impact, but we haven't yet begun to develop our shared measures. We're in the process of designing or developing our shared measures, or we have a fully developed shared measurement system, and that would include a learning process and approach as well. And then D, not applicable, or we're not really engaged in collective impact at this time. So Courtney, let's go ahead and pull up poll number 2.
Okay, everybody should be able to see poll number 2. I see responses coming in. So just a reminder, whenever you are answering this, there should be a panel at the right-hand side of your screen that says polling, and that's where you'll want to answer this poll question. And answers are anonymous, so feel free to enter your responses. We'll give everybody about another 30 or seconds or so, and encourage responses, because it's very interesting to see kind of where people are at in collective impact. And Jen, as people are answering the poll question, we actually had a question come in the Q&A box that we could maybe give you at this time. So this is kind of related to the review that you did with collective impact, and it says, can an organization serve as a backbone and provide programs as well?
That is a great question. So the idea with the backbone is that the backbone serves as a facilitator of creating and pursuing the common agenda of the collaborative. So that common agenda, that set of priorities that the cross-sector collaborative has set together. And the individual playing the backbone, it's really important that they are a guide of the group and the group process, and not driving that process based on their own organization's individual agenda, so that it is truly created and owned by the group. And so ideally, what we see is that the backbone is not also delivering programs, because that can create a conflict of interest, or a challenge in being a neutral or a independent facilitator of that process. Now that said, what we do see is that the backbone staff itself sometimes sits within a broader organization that does have a programmatic function, but that the person playing that backbone role is really dedicated to the collaborative and really not wearing the organizational hat, if you will, but wearing the hat of the vision of the cross-sector collaborative. So they can walk that line of sitting within an organization, but really guiding the group's priorities as opposed to their own individual organization's priorities. The other thing I would say is that we hope that there is sufficient capacity dedicated to playing that backbone role. So often that is a full FTE or more, and so that individual playing the backbone role might have a hard time carving out enough time and energy to play both the backbone role and be a programmatic team member themselves. So it's not a hard and fast rule by any means, but those are considerations when it comes to helping the backbone maintain that perspective that is on behalf of the group and have the time and capacity to play the backbone role. Tiffany, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it really well, Jen. I guess the only other thing I'd add is sometimes we see the backbone functions being split among multiple organizations. So it may be, speaking to that point about capacity, that an individual organization may be a good fit to provide or play the backbone role, but they may not have the full capacity just in themselves to play all the functions of the backbone. There may be another organization in the community that specializes, for instance, in research, or another capacity that's complementary. And so sometimes we see organizations coming together to play the backbone role in conjunction with one another, and sometimes that can alleviate some of the constraints that Jen was referring to.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And great question. Thank you. And if you are interested in more on that, we touched a bit on that in webinar number 2 last month, which I believe there's a recording of. So a little bit more in depth on the role of the backbone there as well. Okay, Courtney, let's go ahead and look at the poll results.
Okay. So they should be posting now for attendees to be able to see.
Great. So only a couple of responses again. I have a feeling that some people might be listening in only, but most folks that responded are not yet doing collective impact. And of those that are engaged, very few have begun the process of developing shared measures. So I would actually say this is pretty reflective of what we see across the field of people doing collective impact. Developing shared measures is something that tends to come later in the process of planning and implementing collective impact. In fact, the Collective Impact Forum recently commissioned a research study. Some of you may be familiar with the results that were published earlier this year. It's called When Collective Impact Has an Impact, and they studied 25 sites across the country, across a broad range of geographies and issue areas. And shared measurement was the area that was least mature, or least developed amongst the sites that they studied, and most challenging. So you all are in good company in the way that the poll results have played out here, and I'm glad to be sharing some thoughts on this today. So I'm going to keep moving here. When we think about developing an effective shared measurement system, there are a couple of areas of considerations that we want to mention to keep in mind. So the first would be thinking about the supportive environment. So how strong are collaborations and relationships, and what are the current dynamics, and what are the current levels of agreement around outcome use? So it can be challenging to come to consensus around shared measures, and can require a fair amount of trust and confidence in your fellow collaborators to share data that might be reflective of the work that you're doing. And so that environment of having deep relationships and trust across organizations can be helpful, not only in the process of identifying the measures, but the process of sharing data across groups. So for the common agenda, is there a common agenda in progress for the sector or the collaborative? So it's not possible, I would say, to develop shared measures until you have that common agenda agreed upon and in place, so that you know what it is that is important to measure. Outcome selection. Across the participating organizations, what is the range of agreement or disagreement about what is important to measure? So I know, there are certain sectors or issue areas where there are a very common set of measures and easily available data, but that is not always the case. So none of these questions here have right or wrong answers, but probably influence how easy or challenging it is to actually to make progress on developing the common shared measures and the measurement learning approach. Then, data collection, what kind of capacity exists across organizations to collect and share data, as well as what kind of structures and systems, both processes and technology exist for collecting this kind of data. And finally, how is data as a group currently used to inform decision making? So all of these are considerations when you think about how ready the context is for beginning and the speed with which you can expect to make progress through the process of putting shared measurement in place. So in a sort of oversimplified schematic, when it comes to creating shared measurement, it could be helpful to think about a process of designing the system, developing, and deploying. And this makes it look very linear. It is, in fact, probably more like a loop that you're always going to be refining and improving the way that this happens. But up front, you can think about starting with the design. So understanding a baseline of the current state of knowledge and data as it relates to the common agenda that has been set. So what data is there and what data might be a new need for us to track progress toward our common agenda. What kind of governance needs to be in place for determining the priorities with respect to data. And then, in that design process, you certainly identify the metrics and the approach to collecting data for the shared measurement system. Sometimes these are going to be measures that are publicly available data. So you might have, in an education example, publicly available, graduation rates and those types of measures that are collected for compliance reasons. But there are also often pieces of data that would be really helpful and important to have that would require new approaches to data collection that don't already exist. And so we are talking about both of those different types of data. So then developing the shared measurement system itself would be development of a web-based platform and data collection tools, as well as the refining and testing the different, if you have new tools or measures that you're going to be using for collecting data, and putting in place staff for managing the data, synthesizing it, and facilitating learning across the group. These web platforms, we often see people using very common tools like Excel and Google Docs that are publicly available, often free. There are certainly more robust technology solutions too, but what I would encourage here is not letting the technology piece be the barrier to making progress, because many initiatives make great progress on this with those simple tools like Google Sheets or Excel. So we can come back to that if people have questions, but technology often can be almost a red herring of an obstacle to making progress. And then finally, deploying. Making sure that the data that's getting collected is being used, and you're always thinking about refining what is being collected to make sure it's meeting the needs of the group and improving over time. So there are certainly a couple of challenges with respect to developing shared measures. Certainly, and we don't want to make this sound like it's an incredibly easy or quick process. I've already spoken to that. But there are, as with, coming to the common agenda itself, there can be difficulty in coming to agreement on the outcomes and indicators, and this can require lots of iteration and skillful facilitation. Concerns about relative performance or comparative measurement. So what this means is, in some shared measurement systems, if you're asking organizations to report on their individual performance on certain measures, you might have data that is now providing apples-to-apples comparison across organizations. And with good reason, there can be fear associated with having your data compared with other organizations, fear of judgment or fear of funding being shifted. And I think that to mitigate this, certainly the peer-to-peer trust and relationships are very important. Funders also can play a really big role in providing a container or a safe space where organizations have confidence that it won't be used in punitive ways, that that data is really being used for improvement. and ultimately for the benefit of participating or ultimate improvement of the work that's happening for the benefit of end users or beneficiaries. And so funders can actually play a very key role here in creating that space that enables true learning when you're looking at data across organizations. A couple other points here that I want to mention. The limited capacity, and this is both time and skill for measurement, can be challenging. This is one of the reasons that it's important to have capacity as part of the backbone team to do a lot of this data collection and analysis and facilitation of group learning with that data, as well as ideally to help do some capacity building across partners as needed when it comes to collecting and using the data. And as Tiffany mentioned, sometimes we do see that backbone role being played across a few different organizations, and most commonly the role that is played by kind of a secondary partner in the back, not secondary, but not where the lead facilitator sits, is an organization with strong research, data analysis, and capacity skills, because that is often a more specialized or customized skill set. So we will see backbone teams where the lead facilitator and some of the process management pieces sit within one organization, and then that research, data, and analysis role sits within a second organization. A research org, sometimes a university partner, can be a good fit for that role. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. A couple of just tips and tricks to bear in mind when you're thinking about developing these shared measures, and then we are going to turn to an example. So when it comes to identifying the indicators itself, it's helpful to keep a manageable number. So we're not talking about 100 indicators. We're not talking about every organization aligning all of their measurement with all of the other organizations in the collaborative. We're talking about a manageable number, like 10 to 15 indicators that folks agree on as those shared pieces of data that everyone will be tracking together and, when relevant, collecting data on in the same way. And within identifying indicators, it can be helpful to have a set of criteria to guide the identification and prioritization of those indicators so that you can first agree on the criteria that will then help you narrow down what those 10 to 15 indicators might be. Second, when it comes to collecting and presenting the data, it can be very helpful to have specific and time-bound goals so that you can report on progress relative to those targets, so that the data doesn't just float out in space but is tied to some goals. Probably a sort of good general measurement practice. Another tip or trick is to track progress with those numbers and percentages. So the numbers make it more tangible and real, and the percentages can also help you kind of calibrate where things are heading over time. And then finally, it's always helpful to think about leveraging existing experts and resources. So many collective impact initiatives will form a voluntary team of data experts. So I'm sure many of you know who within your organization or your partner organizations are those data experts, those with really who are really great with data, have familiarity with all the data sets and spend a lot of their time on that topic. That might be a different person than the person who is involved in the collective impact initiative on a day-to-day basis. And bringing those data experts in to form a data advisory council or just really picking their brains on an as-needed basis is very, very useful and something that I think we often forget to do. So just a reminder to tap the expertise within your networks of those data experts. And then the last bullet here, considering leveraging existing indicators adopted by relevant efforts. So when possible, not recreating the wheel or needing to recreate new data collection when there might be processes in place that already exist. And with this, I like to think of sometimes it's helpful to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So if it's going to be a huge and costly endeavor to collect new data, when something that can give you a sense of the direction and progress, even if it's not perfect, is already readily available, it's worth a serious consideration to use what is more accessible and available if possible. So I'm actually going to keep going, and we'll come back to key takeaways at the end of Tiffany's section. But let's just spend a few minutes on an example from the Roadmap Project. So the Roadmap Project is an education example from Seattle and South King County in Washington State. This is an education-oriented initiative focused on getting dramatic improvements in student achievement from cradle to college and career. So this was a very big region, over 120,000 students, 2/3 students of color, nearly 60% low income, and over 15% are English language learners. So a very large and diverse region. And this region came together to double the number of students in South King County and South Seattle who are on track to graduate from college or career and earn a credential by 2020. They also, as part of their goal statement, are committed to nothing less than closing the unacceptable achievement gaps for low-income students and children of color in their region and increasing achievement for all students from cradle to college and career. So this is an initiative that went through a very robust process to establish their shared measures, and so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that process. So this group has a broad steering committee that governs the effort or oversees it, and then they have a number of different work groups across that cradle to career pipeline. So they have 4 work groups, one for early learning, one for K-12 and in-school progress, one for K-12 out-of-school progress and work, and one for post-secondary. And once these groups formed, pretty much the first thing that they did was think about what measures do they need to track in order to track their progress. And then they aligned the strategies that they were pursuing around what it might take to move the needle on those indicators. So as these groups took on the process of identifying their indicators, they set concrete criteria to identify the indicators. Then they shortlisted their indicators to have kind of a top-level set of indicators. And then because of the work they wanted to take on and the nuance, of course, involved in each of those 4 stages of the education pipeline, they also had a set of secondary supporting indicators that once they got their arms around tracking those primary indicators, they were also going to track over time. So I think it's interesting to look at the indicator criteria that they identified. They identified these criteria so that when they selected the indicators, there was some consistency across the different work groups, as well as to guide each work group's process of identifying criteria. So they had some way to decide what was in and what was out. So just to name a few, the data had to be a valid measure linked to their ultimate goal. They wanted the data to be easily understandable to local stakeholders because one of the priorities in using data is to inform action and to let the public know about the progress of the work. It had to be produced by a trusted source. And given they're working in education, they needed data that was comparable across school districts. They also wanted it to be they wanted to be able to disaggregate that data over time by ethnicity, socioeconomic status, English language learner capability, and gender. And if you remember their goal statement, part of that goal statement was focused on closing achievement gaps. So in order to track progress, they needed to be able to actively and in a nuanced way disaggregate data to determine whether or not that was happening. And they wanted data that they could look at trends over time, and they really wanted data that could influence action. So it needed to be really relevant to the work that the group was taking on. So in many ways, this probably sounds intuitive, and in many ways it is, but even the process of coming to the agreement on what criteria should identify indicators was a useful and helpful process for the collaborative to go through. So then they landed on indicators, and again, if you work in the education field, these don't necessarily seem super complicated or unique. Many of them are quite common indicators of educational attainment, but the process of coming to consensus of those and then the process of collecting the data over time has been very useful for the collaborative. So looking at the left-hand side, percent of children ready to succeed in school by kindergarten. It's required actually development and agreement to new processes for tracking school readiness in a consistent way across 7 different participating school districts and all of the early childhood providers in their region. So one indicator, but a very complex process to get to how you measure that consistently across. And then as you move to the right, you can see the progress of the different kinds of things that would be tracked for K-12, and then all the way through earning a college degree or career credential. And then this data is presented back out to the general public very proactively through an annual report. So the data is certainly used internally by their work groups to inform action, but the Roadmap Project, the Backbone Community Center for Education Results, CCER, also has a priority in engaging the community more broadly in the work, and part of that is being transparent about data in an annual report and being proactive in sharing and communicating that across the public. And so just a screenshot of a sample page of that report, looking at data progress over time where they're seeing gains at the top and things like on-time high school graduation, highlighting areas that need improvement, so which of those indicators are trending flat or in the opposite direction of how they hoped. It might need additional attention and efforts or reconsideration of strategy. And then at the bottom, they separate out each individual school district, holding each district and its leadership accountable to the progress so that it's not just aggregated across the region, but progress can be seen at the individual district level. So there's another example here. We will give access to the slides, but I'm going to just breeze through this very quickly so that I can hand it to my colleague, Tiffany. The one slide I will spend time on here is this is an initiative called Magnolia Place in Southern California and Los Angeles specifically. They are really great at having indicators both at those long-term population level indicators like reading proficiency, as well as real-time measures that are tied to the actual strategies the group is taking on. And that's what's shown on the bottom of the dashboard. So this is where data is collected more like monthly or bi-monthly to track progress on the work that the working groups are taking on over time in a real-time way. So looking at longer-term shared measures as well as indicators of progress in the nearer term. So it's just a different level, a different way to think about what the measures are that the group is tracking. And they use the model, it's called the Model for Improvement, Plan, Do, Study, Act. Some of you on the line may use this in your organizations, but a pretty common learning loop that we know many collective impact initiatives use as their methodology for taking the data, learning, studying it, and acting and improving practice upon what they learn. So I'm going to, we can pause here for some questions before I hand it over to Tiffany to take us through the evaluation section of our session.
All right, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to submit those at this time. Currently, we have not had any that are pending right now.
Okay, well, feel free to add them. I know we're covering a lot of content today, so if things are percolating, take your time. We'll have a few minutes for questions at the end as well. All right, over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks, Jen. So as Jen mentioned, we wanted to start with shared measurement as one of the 5 conditions of collective impact, and something that I think many of us intuitively understand and are probably using similar metrics to track progress within our own organizations, and now we're extending that thinking to how collaborative groups can use a focused set of measures to track progress together and learn together over time. So now we're going to broaden our view even wider and talk about evaluation as a more holistic set of questions that we can understand through data and learn together over time, which includes shared measures but goes beyond it. Next slide. So before we get into breaking down what we mean by evaluating collective impact, I just want to center us in the mindset shift that is involved in moving from evaluating a particular program, which I think most of us are quite familiar with from our existing work, to thinking about evaluating collective impact as part of looking at a complex intervention that's taking place in a community. So when we think about typically program evaluation, what we're hoping to do is understand the impact of a specific intervention, a specific program or set of activities usually managed by one or very few organizations, where there are often a predetermined set of outcomes that we've laid out using a logic model or some other way of understanding cause and effect. So we understand if we do X, then we should get Y. And we set about evaluating our efforts with that in mind, understanding, did we do what we said we would do to the quality that we hoped to do it, and did it produce the specific results that we had identified? And we typically conduct evaluations toward the end of a cycle of work, so end of a year, end of a few years. So now when we're shifting toward evaluating collective impact, we think about it a little bit differently. So now we're looking to understand how multiple parts of the system are working together. That means understanding the component parts, those specific programs or areas of work, as well as the connections. How are the different parts of the system in the community working together? And that involves looking at a different set of questions or a different set of outcomes with different measurement approaches. The other piece is that when you're working in a complex situation in a community, as many of you certainly experience, you can't predict all the outcomes that might emerge. And you may not know exactly when they might happen or in what relationship, what leads to what. Sometimes you do some work that you think will have a major impact and you don't see, commensurate to the effort that you put in. In other cases, you might see a huge amount of momentum, influence, and ultimately progress from something that was a relatively small amount of effort, but it was applied at a leverage point in the system that led to a big result. And so the unpredictability of how outcomes might emerge is something that we try to take into account when we're thinking about evaluating collective impact. And finally, embedding opportunities for feedback and learning throughout the course of the initiative. So rather than waiting until the end of a year or end of a few years to do a pretty large-scale evaluation, how can we think about using the data from shared measurement system as well as additional data to learn and improve over time? I'll talk about that in more detail for the rest of the presentation. Next slide. So to break it down a bit more, when we're thinking about evaluating a collective impact initiative, we can think about 4 aspects of the work that we might focus on. So the first is context. What is the political, social, community history, the context around the work that might influence what we're able to achieve together and when, or what we need to take into account when doing our work. Then there's the initiative itself. How are the different partners that are involved in the initiative working together and engaging the community in order to do effective work together over time? The third would be the systems targeted by the initiative. So are we starting to see changes in policy, funding, communication, relationships between different systems that we think will get us towards the ultimate goals in terms of population level impacts that we hope to see? And then finally, the initiative's impact on people's lives. Are we seeing the population level outcomes we hope to see, and why do we think that is or not? What are some of the underlying factors in the long term that we think contributed to the progress that we're seeing? These are 4 more specific areas of inquiry that can be addressed through evaluating collective impact. So now that we have that structure, next slide, we can see that the shared measurement system is a component of more broadly evaluating collective impact, and that both play a role. The shared measurement system helps us to take a laser focus together with a broad group of people on progress over time on key metrics that we most centrally see as related to our goals. Whereas evaluation allows us to look systematically at a broader set of questions that let us know at different stages of our work, how are we doing? And what do we need to do differently in order to move our shared measures more in the direction that we hope to see? And one sub-note is that the shared measurement system actually, it provides data, but it can also be evaluated. It can be one of the things that you look at to say, how effectively is the shared measurement system working for us? Are our metrics informing us? Is the way that we're sharing our data helping our partners and our community participate in this work with us? So there are many different questions that evaluation can answer, and we'll talk about how you might think about that for work that you're engaged in. Next slide. So the four aspects of what evaluation could focus on may not all be relevant at the same point in time. So what we have here in this slide is a way of thinking about how collective impact efforts unfold from their initiation to the impacts that we hope to see. And here we point out where certain questions might be most relevant to try to answer together with partners that are engaged in the effort. So in the early years of the initiative, even as it's forming, getting an understanding of the social, political, economic, community context around the work in a systematic way helps partners be prepared to structure an effort, involve relevant partners, and confront initial questions that help the initiative get off on good footing. And continuing to pay attention to that question helps to track how the community context is influencing how the effort is unfolding in communities, or what should be taken into account over time. Also in the beginning of a collective impact initiative, it might be particularly relevant to focus on how the different parts of the initiative are working together, how much, for instance, communities have embraced the common agenda, or how well residents are being engaged and their voices being taken into account in the effort. So some of these questions about how it's all working together might be some of the earlier questions you might focus on with the kind of data collection that would be involved in evaluating the initiative. And then, as time has passed and there's more potential to see systems changes unfolding, that's the time that you're more likely to turn your attention to, are we seeing those system impacts that we hope to see? Are we seeing the types of behavior changes that we hope to see? Are we on track for the kinds of changes in our community conditions and systems and programs that we think will get us towards our ultimate impact? And then while you might be tracking data toward ultimate impacts all along, it becomes more and more relevant in the later years when you would expect to see some of your more ambitious goals that might take 5, 10 years to materialize. Are we starting to see those tick in the direction that we hope to see? And why or why not? What is contributing to what we hope to see, or what's holding us back? So in a way, looking at what stage the effort is in helps to make evaluation efforts most relevant and most manageable, because you don't have to tackle every question simultaneously, but rather focus on the kinds of questions that are most relevant to you in that moment. Next slide. So we're going to take one more chance at a poll. Want to see where folks are. And for this, given that it seems like, at least for those who responded, most people are not involved in a collective impact initiative now, I suggest that you respond in terms of another effort that you're involved in that is collaborative in nature, or something that you have been involved in the past. How much can you relate from your own experience to what I've been saying so far? So when you think about an effort you're involved in now or you have been involved in the past, which of these aspects of the work are you or were you evaluating as part of that work? The context around the work, how partners were collaborating, and how effectively that collaboration was reaching people. Were systems changes happening, and were you seeing ultimate long-term impact?
All right, well, the poll is now open. So if you can go to the polling tab and go ahead and submit your answer. With this one, please select all that apply. So you can select multiple answers if that is true for your collaborative that you're talking about. We'll give everybody another 30 seconds, and then we'll close the poll. Seeing some answers come in, so that's great. Keep them coming. Okay, I'm seeing a couple are still in progress, so we'll let you all finish up by submitting your answer, and then we will share the poll results. Okay, closing the poll, we'll be sharing in just a moment. Okay, you should be able to see the results.
Okay, great. All right, so we had a few more responses this time, steadily ticking up. It seems that most folks who responded are focused on systems changes as well as ultimate impact, and fewer focused on the initiative context or the initiative itself, and that makes a lot of sense. That's pretty common. And one of the things that we're hoping to do in sharing this framework and way of thinking about evaluating collaborative initiatives is to introduce the idea that it may be worth dedicating time and resources and effort to understanding all four of these during the time that they're most relevant, because it helps the initiative engage in continuous learning and adaptation from beginning to end. So thanks for participating in the poll. So moving on to the next slide, what we wanted to do is spend some time thinking about how to get started with this. And a great place to start is to identify key learning questions. What are the burning questions on your minds, on partners' minds, things that are coming up again and again that seem to be real linchpins in terms of understanding how the work is going and what is needed to make the initiative even more effective. And so in terms of context, again, looking at cultural, socioeconomic, and political factors from multiple vantage points, multiple subpopulations in the community, from the perspective of many participants in the initiatives. What are the factors that are most important to pay attention to? Or there may be questions about design and implementation that focus, for instance, on the backbone. So to what extent and in what ways is the backbone providing the kinds of leadership support and guidance that partners actually need to do their work? It might be a question worth collecting some data to answer. In terms of systems, as I've mentioned, these could be questions about funding flows and how funding is shifting. Is it reflective of our priorities? Are policies changing? Are social norms changing? So looking at the ways that the systems that we think need to change, to what extent are they changing? And maybe what systems changes are emerging that we wouldn't have even thought about? and what maybe systems barriers are emerging as a result of or alongside our work. And then finally, impact. So this involves seeing ultimate outcomes as well as what contributed or what hindered. What can we learn from the extent to which we're seeing our outcomes materialize? So once you have a sense of your learning questions, then you can design measurement efforts that really target answering those questions. And that could bring together qualitative data, so interviews, focus groups, facilitated conversations with groups where people are sharing their ideas and perspectives, to surveys, to looking at evidence of impact in documentation and in the community, to looking at data that's collected in data sets as part of shared measurement systems. All of this data could be potentially harnessed to address the kinds of questions you have once you have a sense of what they are. Next slide. So now that we have a sense of our learning questions, we can identify the most relevant outcomes and indicators that get us to designing data collection that answers, provides data toward the indicators that are most relevant to us. So again, this is really a matter of breaking down our expectations. So what do we hope to see in this example from our backbone organization? What do we think are the most important elements of strategic guidance or leadership? What are the most important qualities? And is this leading towards the type of organizational alignment that we most hope to see? Those are the kinds of outcomes that might be most relevant, and there might be specific indicators that would show us the backbone organization is achieving the kinds of outcomes for the group that we hope to see, that we can then design evaluation and measurement approaches to help us gather systematic information to answer and reflect on together with those involved in the initiative in order to make improvements. Next slide. So what we're talking about is both accountability and learning. And so we can think about accountability from a couple of different angles. Some of them are probably part and parcel to how many of us think about the ways or purposes of evaluation, and some of them might be a little bit different, but ultimately make sense. So there's certainly accountability in terms of responsibility for one's actions, for doing what we said we'd do it in the way we said we would do it, and for choosing strategies that we think are effective. Then there's accountability from a strategic standpoint, which we generally we take to mean individuals and organizations are being accountable to the strategy and to the group. So people are pursuing their work as effectively as they can. They have really embraced the common agenda. They are committed to it and what it means for shifting the activities of their organization, for how they communicate publicly and how they champion the effort in the community. So people they're committed, they're following through, they're bringing their best selves to the work, they're genuinely collaborating, they are engaging in mutually reinforcing activities. These are the things that we want to see when we think about people being accountable to producing results as part of a collaborative. And then finally, we can look at accountability for learning. So are people committed to collecting and using data to learn in order to improve their work over time? All of these ways of thinking about accountability and learning are what we encourage from seeing the ways that initiatives across the country have used evaluation and measurement for learning improvement over time. Next slide. So to go into a little bit more detail in terms of customizing your evaluation approach to the types of questions that you're answering, just wanted to lay out a three-part framework for understanding the types of evaluation that are sort of available for different stages of the work. So often when initiatives are just getting started, they're exploring the context, the relationships between partners, they're developing action plans and approaches, and the work is not set in stone. It's pretty flexible, and as a result, it's usually pretty helpful to have data that responds to the shifting questions and concerns of the group. And an approach to doing that is called developmental evaluation. It accepts and embraces the fact that the work is in flux and focuses on providing real-time data to inform the shifting questions of the group. And so this could be really short pulse surveys or groups of interviews to address very specific questions that help people continuously hone their approaches or make decisions between different options for doing their work. Then formative evaluation often comes into place when the initiative is still evolving, but it's being refined. The work has been underway for a while. People have a bit of a sense of, okay, these are the core elements of the work. This is our action plan. These are our intentions. And our outcomes are a bit more predictable. We know what we hope to see from certain efforts that we're undertaking. And in that point in the work, formative evaluation can be more appropriate. That's what we sometimes refer to as process evaluation, or more in the style of a more typical program evaluation, where you have some work that reflects intended strategies or activities and some outcomes that you hope to see. And so you collect data systematically to understand, is the work unfolding as we expected, and is it producing the results that we hope to see? Why or why not? And then finally, when an initiative is more stable, it's well established, the work has been underway for quite some time, and we are starting to have expectations that we would see progress toward our long-term outcomes. Then we shift to understanding what outcomes are we seeing and what helped us get there. What worked and did not work from many different perspectives, including people that are beneficiaries of the work, people who are participants in the initiative, as well as potentially external informants that can say, the work that you all did on X, Y, and Z was instrumental to achieving some of these outcomes. And so it involves taking a broader view of understanding the merit, value, significance of the efforts that the initiative undertook and what they actually produced in the community. Next slide. And so I won't go into this one in detail, but just wanted to note for those who are seeking resources afterward, we also, as part of this deck, have laid out what some of the evaluation questions are that respond to each of these three stages. I kind of cover these in the overview, but just want to refer you to this specific slide. Next slide. So now we'll just very briefly touch on an example, picking up again with the roadmap project, just to illustrate the comparison and contrast with shared measurement, and then I'll leave a minute or two for any remaining questions. So as Jen provided an overview earlier, roadmap project is a Cradle to Career initiative in Seattle and South County, developed a really robust shared measurement system with really specific goals, targets, and indicators that they were tracking over time. They also undertook evaluation. And when they did their evaluation work, they focused in this particular example on the 4 elements of their goal: alignment among the organizations in the community, parent and community engagement, using data for continuous improvement and community engagement and buy-in, and building stronger systems. These were the 4 components that they identified as being instrumental to achieving their goal. And when they went about evaluating their effort, they actually looked at how some of these elements were coming into a place, how well they were working, and what that was leading to. And that led them to some insights for their work. Next slide. So they looked at how the project was being implemented on the ground, what were the roles of various groups, and how much were the actions of the work groups being supported by the backbone organization. They looked at their core strategies and how they were using them to catalyze systems change. And finally, they looked at what systems changes were actually occurring. Next slide. And that led them to some insights. about how the work was unfolding in terms of beginning to see elements of alignment, seeing results of their community engagement efforts, that people had a high degree of knowledge and buy-in, but also seeing some challenges, that there were stakeholders in the community that were not being effectively engaged, that they needed to focus on. They saw some of the successes that Jen pointed out in terms of building data capacity and adopting common metrics, and they also saw increases in collaboration. So there were some validating results to this evaluation, as well as pointing to some areas that they needed to improve. Next slide. And so what they did was they shaped their work around this. So CCER, referred to in the headline, is the backbone organization. And what they did is they kept certain elements of their work front and center, and they focused on others. So they focused on improving communication with a new newsletter, with expanding the voices that were involved in the initiative and communicating about the initiative. They also saw a need to increase their focus on equity and inclusion, and they put in place specific activities to do that. And then finally, they built on their successes with their shared measurement system in order to more effectively communicate out the data. So they created new briefings, they created new roundtables to share results so that they could engage the community even more effectively around the data that they were collecting. So you can see how actionable a lot of the results of this evaluation were while they were in a place of honing their strategies and activities in order to have an impact on the kinds of system changes that they want to see and ultimately long-term outcomes for the community. So I'll stop there. I think this is a good time to open it up in case there are any one or two last questions. And then I know that we're basically at time, so Courtney, if there aren't any questions, we can turn it over to you to wrap it up.
Okay, I am not seeing any questions at this time, but I'll go ahead and do kind of our final remarks, and then if anybody does have a question or two, feel free to submit those as I'm going through the last few slides. Okay, let me take back the controls and just one moment, getting to it. Okay. So just a reminder on our upcoming webinars. We do have a couple more webinars in the Collective Impact series, as you saw on that previous slide by FSG. So we've had 3 now within this mini-series, and we did record the first 2. We're also recording today's. So those are going to be posted online on our website, communityactionpartnership.com, for you to review those recordings. We will also post the slides, and so you can look online for those under our Tools and Resources section of our website, or if you would like, you can email me. My email will be posted at the end of this webinar. We also have several September webinar topics coming up, and so encourage you to check out our webinars page to register for those, communityactionpartnership.com, and then if you go to events and go to webinars, you can find a way to register for the ones that you're interested in. We also have our Community Action Academy site, and we also post the recordings and the PDF of the slides in there. And so you can go to moodle.communityactionpartnership.com. You can create a free account, and once your account is confirmed via email, you can go to, you can log in again and go to course categories, learning communities, and then under open learning community groups, you can choose which group you're wanting to access. So this one is the results at the community level learning community group, and you can access previous meeting materials as well as resources from this webinar also. We also have our annual convention coming up at the end of this month, and there is still time to register. If you're still interested, online registration stays open until August 21st. We have several sessions that are available through our Learning Community Resource Center that we're sponsoring. So this is just kind of an overview of what we're offering, and hopefully many of you can join us and will join us in these different sessions. And with that, don't want to hold anyone over time, so here's our contact info. And if you're needing any resources or slides after the webinar or having trouble finding them, please feel free to email me at Kohler, the third one down. And of course, anyone in our rest of our team is able to help as well. So special thanks to our presenters today. We appreciate you, Jen and Tiffany, sharing this great content with us. And we hope everyone has a great day.